Hi everyone, this is Team 3's final presentation on domestic violence for legal aspects of the healthcare system. The Department of Justice defines domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behaviors in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. Domestic violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. Walter Kojusek, a licensed professional counselor, certified reciprocal alcohol drug counselor, and senior manager of behavioral health programs, quoted in the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, defines domestic violence as the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behaviors as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. General statistics about domestic violence is that domestic violence is a form of physical and or sexual abuse. Other forms of abuse include emotional, economic, and psychological abuse. Each year, over 2 million injuries and 13,000 deaths are caused as a result of domestic violence. But only 34% of people who are injured by an intimate partner receives medical care. Shockingly, beyond physical impacts, victims of domestic violence lose a total of 8 million days of paid work each year. The cost of domestic abuse exceeds $8.3 billion. Connecticut statistics report that 1/3 of all criminal court cases involve family violence. 56,178 victims are served annually, and 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are victims of domestic violence. 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. Domestic violence alone affects more than 12 million people each year. Almost half of the women and men have experienced psychological aggression by their significant other in the United States. Domestic violence is the third leading cause of homelessness among families. Domestic violence victims can be protected with both federal and state laws, and depending on the situation, could either go to civil or criminal court. One of the biggest federal laws is the Violence Against Women Act. This was created to diminish violence and help build the victims back up again. VAWA creates funds and programs throughout the country to benefit these victims. Funds are used for many things, like victim court fees, rape kits, and training for police units. Rape kits are used to gather evidence for investigators and has to be collected within 48 hours of the incident. And the police training could help provide safer communities for the future, therefore diminishing the violence. There is also a hotline that could be used by victims so they can speak to someone confidently and not feel as if they're getting anyone in trouble or will get caught themselves. In 2005, the VAWA was able to update the Gun Control Act so that abusers could not get their hands on a gun. This has benefited the victims and the severity of the violence in some cases. Another aspect of this law is that it does not allow an abuser to follow their victim to another state. Once an abuser is convicted, that person has no right to be near the victim, never mind follow them. Another law within the federal court system is that domestic violence green card. This card protects undocumented victims from their citizen abusers. They can obtain one as long as they help the police officer prosecute the abuser. When it comes to state laws for domestic violence, they vary depending on where it happens. One of the biggest differences is reporting. For most states, if anyone in any profession or situation believes that there is domestic violence going on, they must report it. It becomes a legal issue if they do not do so. Most states believe in this view of the law, including New Jersey, Wyoming, and Hawaii. The other view of reporting law is when a state believes that certain professionals should not report. This is like in California, where their psychologists and counselors do not have to report domestic violence. This way, the victims feel as if they can open up to someone without feeling as though they're getting their abuser in trouble. Another law would be how states handle torts within family situations. Most states do not allow family members to sue with torts because it will only hurt the family more. Other states have realized that if it's gotten to the point of suing with tort, the family is already broken in most cases. Depending on the case, the states that did not allow this sometimes will overrule this law. This happens when a tort is intentional. Intentional torts are when someone means to do the damage they did, and because domestic violence can be battery or assault, it is intentional. Also, arrest on the scene laws are different from state to state. For some states, they believe it is easier to arrest both people involved. This to keep the victim safe after the police leave. And other states leave it up to the police to decide whether it is the best option or not. If they do not make an arrest, they must make a police report explaining why. Because there are multiple different forms of domestic violence, there is also a variety of degrees that can be charged to the abuser. Under the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Act, if any of these crimes are committed, the abuser's court's record will include a title noting that the conviction involves family violence. In terms of pattern to domestic violence, it first begins with threats from an abuser. There are 2 degrees or levels of threats in Connecticut that can be applied for penalty purposes. After threats, the abuser may escalate to physically assaulting the victim. Assault is split into 3 categories that an abuser can be charged with, and because abusers can also commit other forms of abuse with varying degrees of sexual assault and other crimes such as harassment, stalking, strangulation, and reckless endangerment, they can face charges under those categories with notation that it involved family violence. First-degree threatening covers threats regarding the use of hazardous substance or firearm intended to terrorize the victim. Second-degree threatening covers all other threats intended to terrorize the victim or cause fear of imminent and serious physical injury. First-degree assault is the highest level of assault. This pertains to situations where death or serious injury occurs from particularly violent situations, such as the use of firearms or dismemberment. Second-degree assault is the middle level where physical injury occurs from other means, such as the use of deadly weapons or dangerous instruments, intentionally causing a person to become partially or wholly unconscious. Physical impairment or injury by unconsented drugging or another mean without consent. Third-degree assault is when physical injury occurs from intentional or reckless acts, which includes a less egregious than those under second-degree assault. Physical injury caused with criminal negligence and use of deadly weapons, dangerous instruments, or electronic defense weapons. In the state of Connecticut, there isn't a specific charge for domestic abuse or violence. Domestic violence encompasses a variety of crimes such as assault, threatening, stalking, sexual assault, and violation of court orders. In Connecticut, first-degree assault is considered a Class B felony, which can result in the sentencing of 1 to 20 years in prison. Assault of a pregnant woman resulting in the termination of the pregnancy is a Class A felony, meaning that sentencing can be 10 to 15 years in prison. Second-degree assault is a Class D felony and can result in 1 to 5 years in prison sentencing. Third-degree assault is a Class A misdemeanor that can result up to 1 year in jail. Both first-degree threatening and stalking are Class D felonies that can result in 1 to 5 year prison sentencing. Second-degree threatening and stalking are both Class A misdemeanors that can result in up to 1 year in jail. First-degree sexual assault can either be Class A or Class B felony depending on whether or not the act is aggravated sexual assault. First-degree aggravated sexual assault can result in 10 to 25-year prison sentencing, whereas first-degree sexual assault can result in 1 to 20-year prison sentencing. Sexual assault in spousal or cohabiting relationship is a class felony that can result in 1 to 20-year prison sentencing. Second-degree assault can either be a Class B or C felony and result in 9 months to 20-year prison sentencing. Other punishments for domestic abuse that can accompany or take place of jail time are court-ordered anger management or other intervention programs, restraining or protection court orders, supervised visitation with children, or complete termination of parental rights. Violation of restraining or protection court orders is a Class D felony that can result in a 1 to 5 year prison sentencing. Battered woman syndrome, sometimes referred to as battered wife syndrome or battered person syndrome, is the highly variable symptom complex of physical and psychological injuries exhibited by a woman repeatedly abused, especially physically, by her mate. It is not limited to just wives or women, but can occur in any individual that has experienced long-term domestic abuse. Individuals affected by this syndrome will sometimes act out against their abusive partner, resulting in serious injury or death of the abuser. In some cases, this syndrome is an effective defense strategy, allowing defendants to avoid guilty verdicts and jail time. In order for battered wife syndrome to be a viable defense, the defendant must prove the danger of serious harm or death was imminent, reasonable belief that he or she would be harmed, the response to danger was reasonable. Francine Hughes lived with her abusive ex-husband Mickey Hughes even after they got a divorce. Francine had suffered through 30 years of physical and emotional abuse from Mickey until March 9, 1977, when she had enough. After receiving yet another beating from Mickey in front of her children, Francine called the police to report the abuse. The police came to the house but could not arrest Mickey because they had not witnessed the abuse. After the police had left, Mickey proceeded to beat and rape Francine. That night, Francine covered her husband and the house in gasoline and set them both on fire after leaving the house with her children. She then turned herself in to the police and confessed that what she had done. In November of the same year, Francine was acquitted of first-degree murder under the defense of temporary insanity. Although the defense was not called battered wife syndrome, it brought light to the syndrome and set the precedent that battered spouses can be acquitted of crimes committed against their abusers. Francine met the requirements of battered wife syndrome and was able to prove to the jury that she should not be accountable for her actions. It is mandatory for a healthcare professional to report any suspicion or evidence that domestic violence is taking place. The law varies from state to state as to when reporting abuse is mandatory. However, for the most part, if a healthcare professional has evidence or a strong suspicion that a patient is a victim of domestic violence, they are obligated to report it. Abuse can include battery, firearm injury, sexual abuse, spousal abuse, etc., from one individual to another. Therefore, healthcare providers are the main group of people who make the reports. These healthcare providers can include doctors, nurse practitioners, therapists, physical therapists, social workers, or any licensed caregiver. Sometimes patients can get confused as to who is considered a healthcare provider and therefore who can report domestic violence. According to Futures Without Violence, there are only 3 states that do not require mandatory reporting when it comes to domestic violence. These states are New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Oklahoma, in which they are not required to report abuse if the patient is over 18, with some exceptions. In every other state in the country, it is mandatory to report such abuse, and if the healthcare provider fails to do so, it can be classified as a misdemeanor. Patients also choose to report their own abuse. However, this is not likely due to the victim being scared to go to the police. The victim could be frightened by the possibility of the abuser's reaction towards the report. A witness of the abuse can also report the violence, but again, the witness needs to think about the possible consequences for reporting without the consent of the victim involved. According to Futures Without Violence, before screening the patient for domestic abuse, the healthcare provider must be clear about the mandatory reporting requirements to the patient. It is critical that the healthcare provider discusses the limits of confidentiality with the patient. It is not only important for the patient-physician relationship, but is also important so the patient feels safe and in control. Not informing the patient about the requirements can also lead to dangerous situations such as the abuser retaliating. Once the patient is aware of the report, there are certain requirements that the report must hold. Each state varies, but overall, the minimum requirement for a report must include the name of the patient and some information about them, the location and date of the abuse, the patient's injuries described in detail, and the name of and the identity of the abuser and how they are related to the victim. The report should go more into detail if it will help the victim and the case. Overall, the report must hold enough information to make a case. The victim is not always aware of who the abuser is. Sometimes the abuse occurs without the victim getting a clear image of the abuser. In this case, the report needs enough information to at least know any features of the abuser that stood out. For example, maybe this victim saw the abuser was wearing or saw what kind of car he or she was driving. Anything that would help determine who was involved would be necessary for the report. Once a report is filed, the situation can sometimes get complicated. In certain cases, the victim can feel frightened or intimidated when the police get involved. Many victims don't like the fact that the police are involved due to the possibility of the abuser becoming more violent and retaliate against the report. It is possible that the police will investigate the situation by going into their homes and questioning their families. If they feel like there is enough evidence against the abuser, the police could arrest the abuser, push charges, or make them go to court. This can make the victim feel unsafe at times, which is really the worst thing that can happen going through domestic violence. To make the patient or victim feel safer, as healthcare providers, your job is to comfort them and make them feel safe. It is, for some reason, the patient is worried for their safety, then it may be a good idea to contact the hospital security or police to escort the patient home and make sure that they are safe. It's also a good idea to enroll the patient in counseling so that they can talk to someone about what they're doing. There are some cases, however, that a report isn't filed. For example, there are 3 states that don't have mandatory reporting. So in these states, the report is not always filed. Another situation in which a report isn't filed is if there isn't enough hard evidence that supports a suspicion of domestic violence. In these cases, a healthcare provider should make it clear to the patient that they should come back to the hospital if any problems occur. The issues of domestic violence seem to have increased over the years, so healthcare professionals need to be ready to handle these situations. First of all, healthcare professionals need to be trained and educated in the hospital protocols when dealing with domestic violence. Connecticut Journal Statistics, Section 20 to 10b, require all medical and surgical professionals seeking licensure renewal to complete a continuing education program, which must include at least 1 hour of education or training relating to domestic violence. According to Compendium of State Statutes and Policies on Domestic Violence in Healthcare, written by Nancy DeBurrow, research shows that it is important to provide victims with ongoing supportive access to medical care, addressing safety issues, and guiding patients through available options. These are the duties of healthcare professionals to provide comfort, care, and safety. Talking to the patient about reporting the issue to the police right away might scare them. So first you need to make them feel safe and make them feel heard. According to Medical Provider's Guide to Managing the Care of Domestic Violence Patient with Cultural Context, there are 6 relationship factors that a healthcare provider should have with a patient. These factors are empathy, empowerment, validation, acceptance, boundaries, and honesty. The patient needs to feel like the physician understands his or her situation and really cares about it. The patient needs to feel in control of his or her decisions. The patient also needs to know that the healthcare provider believes him and her in what is happening. The healthcare provider needs to offer his or her acceptance towards the patient's beliefs, and there needs to be a set of boundaries in relationship because at the end of the day, the healthcare provider needs to follow protocol. Lastly, healthcare providers needs to be honest with the patient about the routine. The Guide to Managing Care also explains to be successful in these 6 relationship factors, there needs to be a used set of skills. These skills include communication, active listening, and reflecting. These will help the patient feel more understood and safe. Lastly, the healthcare provider should connect patients to an on-set domestic violence advocate and social worker. There are many moral dilemmas and issues that can arise when reporting domestic abuse cases. One major issue is the idea that domestic abuse is a private family issue and should not be publicized. Domestic abuse victims may be embarrassed about their situation and may not want others to know what's going on in their home behind closed doors. The reporter might also feel uncomfortable reporting the abuse if they second guess their interpretation of what's going on. They may be hesitant to get authorities involved, thinking that it is a one-time occurrence rather than a long-term abuse. Another issue that can arise may be that the victim does not want the abuse reported. Just because an incident of abuse is reported does not necessarily mean that there will be successful intervention and safe remedy for the victim. Violence often escalates when victims try to leave their abusers. If the abuse is reported and the victim has to return to her abuser, the situation can worsen and put the victim at a greater risk. Victims may also not want to report abuse because it can negatively affect their families. Reporting domestic abuse can result in children being separated from one or both parents, which may not be something the victim is willing to have happen. Lastly, mandatory reporting of domestic abuse may make victims of abuse less likely to seek out medical care. Victims of abuse may be afraid to seek medical attention, which can compromise their health and less able to address their abusive situation. October is considered Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and prevention starts with these following steps. Know the signs. Domestic violence is a real problem that can affect anyone, whether it be a close family friend or a neighbor. It is important to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence to prevent the spread of this issue. Note an abusive relationship by jealousy arising from time spent with family or friends away from the partner, discouraging any time spent away from the partner, embarrassing or shaming, controlling financial decisions, forcing guilt for all the problems within the relationship, prevention from work, intentional damage to property, threatening violence against partner, pets, or someone whom you love to gain compliance, pressure to have sex when there's no desire, and physical intimidation, including use of weapons. Don't ignore the signs. If you suspect a domestic violence dispute, call the police. Don't worry about overstepping boundaries or not wanting to get involved. Lend an ear. If someone chooses to confide in you, do not judge their experiences, but be respectful and listen without judgment. Believe what they are telling you and ask what you can do to help. Be available. If someone you know is thinking about leaving but is fearful of the escalation of violence, be there to provide help. Be aware of your own safety, but keep your phone charged with the ringer on, keep a full tank of gas, and discuss an escape plan or a meeting place ahead of time. Know the number to nearby shelters in cases where someone may need a refuge in a hurry. Check in regularly. If the victim is someone you know, reach out to them regularly to ensure his or her safety. Be a resource. Someone with a domestic violence situation may not always be able to research local shelters, escape plans, or set up necessities like bank accounts and cell phones while under the grip of the abuser. So be a resource to them and help them out when gathering this information. And get the word out. Spread awareness to this growing problem and be the loud voice to a quiet problem. Provide efforts in raising money and awareness to local shelters. Use personal connections to spread awareness within the workplace, church group, clubs, and around the community. The following slides are a list of resources that we use to research our topic. We thank you guys for listening, and we hope that you learned something about how domestic violence plays a role in the legal aspects of the healthcare system.